unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.
Welcome to unSILOed. This is Greg LeBlanc, and I'm here today with Travis Rieder, who is a professor of bioethics at Johns Hopkins University, also philosophy, health policy, right? All of those things that intersect medicine, philosophy, ethics, and so forth. Also the author of a couple of books. Most recent book is called Catastrophe Ethics, How to Choose Well in a World of Tough Choices, which focuses primarily on things like climate change, but also on all sorts of other areas. You talk about abortion, you talk about whether to have children or adopt, a bunch of other things. And also this book, which is, I guess it's partially a memoir and partially a discussion of the ethics around opioids and opioid prescriptions. It's called In Pain, a Bioethicist's Personal Struggle with Opioids. Welcome, Travis.
Thanks for having me. You might be the most ambitious interviewer I've ever had. You have both books in front of you. That's really impressive.
Well, I enjoyed both of them. And, maybe we can start with the book In Pain. It was your first book. And, it was a very powerful book, very powerful memoir. And I guess the thing that struck me the most was after going through the experience that you went through, it's almost like you were ashamed to some degree. You found it difficult to even talk about it. So here you are, a practicing bioethicist, interacting with doctors on a daily basis. And you go through this very difficult medical experience, and you're reluctant to talk about it. I mean, it seems like somebody who is sitting both in the world of bioethics and has firsthand experience of what people are going through would be in a really, great position to talk about this. And, we're I think you quote in the book that we have about 100,000 people dying every year because of overdoses. And while I think a lot of the discussion is about, treatment and remedying this problem, certainly here in San Francisco, it's front row problem. A lot of people talking about how to, help these people. Much less discussion about how to prevent the problem in the first place. And so I guess one question is, why did you find it so difficult, at least initially, to talk about your experience after you had gone through it?
It's a really good question. I mean, it ends up being, I think, part of why I make this a research project for myself, part of why I end up writing this book. So the book comes out in 2019, but the motorcycle accident that I had that started this whole situation was in 2015. And so there's this couple of years after I have the medical trauma where I'm thinking a lot about what happened to me, and I'm talking with colleagues and slowly sharing what happened. And I think part of why I end up really exploring this as part of my career is several of them would say to me over the course of months, Travis, you're a bioethicist. You've now sort of lived in the healthcare system. You have this first personal experience. And it had to do with drugs, which is just monumentally important right now, this moment in our country. As you said, over 100,000 people dying a year from drug overdose. And so my experience, yes, I got hit by a motorcycle, I got hit on my motorcycle. But the thing that really ends up defining my medical trauma is this protracted withdrawal from opioids that I go through. And it's so devastating that I think it's going to kill me. At one point, 4 weeks into a withdrawal syndrome, I started thinking about killing myself. Like it's the worst experience I've ever gone through. And I almost lost my foot to a motor vehicle accident, right? Like every moment of withdrawal was the worst moment of my life. So I come out of this and I never even reflect on it. I never even reflect on why it is the case. But after 4 weeks of withdrawal, I realized that I've not told anyone. So I have this incredibly supportive partner who has a starring role in the book. Her name is Sadia. I had a 1.5-year-old at the time, which is crazy to say because she's 10 right now downstairs playing. And during this time, they're the only people in my life who watched me suffer this way. So yeah, so eventually I come out of this withdrawal experience, and I slowly start to share it with the people closest to me about how much it ruptured our lives and how much it weighed on our family and how sick I was and how I really didn't think that I would ever make it off of these medications. And enough people who were close enough to that they could say this sort of thing started saying to me, like, do you think maybe you have something to contribute here? And so the first time I publicly told my story, I told it to a group of faculty at something we have called the Research Retreat. And the director of my institute, Jeff Kahn, who's an amazing bioethicist and a good friend, he heard the story. He raised his hand, asked one of the first questions. And he's like, Travis, why didn't you come to us? You're a professor at Johns Hopkins. You have friends in relatively high places in all the right ways. You have more access than almost anybody. Why didn't you exploit your network to figure this out? And all I could say is, I don't know. And he said, that feels kind of important, don't you think? Right? Because most people don't have access to all this stuff. So there seems to be some like shame wrapped up in it. Like, it felt private in a way. Mm-hmm. But I mean, I have an orthopedic surgeon friend at Hopkins. She'd seen the x-rays of my exploded foot, right? My doctor friends had seen the pictures of my, mangled lower limb with bones sticking out. So that didn't seem private, but the withdrawal did. And I worked a couple of years on unpacking why that was.
Well, what's amazing is, look, you have a wonderful family. You have a stable income. You have good neighbors. You have colleagues, right? You have access to all these resources, and you found it incredibly difficult to wean yourself off these medications. Now, most people aren't in that lucky of a position. I mean, most people who are trying to wean themselves off these drugs, they don't have that kind of support. So they generally don't succeed in weaning themselves off. But I mean, when I was growing up as a kid, I mean, I heard these horror stories from my parents, right? About heroin and the addiction. And it was just like, don't go near this stuff. I mean, I had a roommate who died of an overdose, back in the 90s. So like it was common knowledge of the addictive properties of opiates. And I remember going to the NIH, an event in like 2001, where they were saying that, oh yeah, these things aren't addictive. Very, very smart people. How did they ever get this notion that somehow these substances are all of a sudden not addictive anymore?
It's a wild story. I mean, I tell a version of the history in the book, but depending on which part you're interested in, there are journalists and historians who have done different parts of it far better and more thoroughly than I did there. But the reason I told the version I did is because, if you want to get the most detailed, rigorous version of the last 30 years, you should go read Patrick Raddenkeef's Empire of Pain, right? Because the moment we're living in right now is so deeply, deeply tied to what happened with Purdue Pharma and the companies that responded to the way they acted and the Sackler family. So there's that part, and that part's been talked about a lot. But what I found really interesting when I tried to answer this question, so I actually tried to answer a slightly more complicated question, because yes, there was this moment in the late 90s, early 2000s where you went to the NIH and heard this wild thing, like, hey, opiates are not that addictive. Yes, that's true. That moment happened. But what was wild for me is when I was in the hospital in 2015, I had a bunch of physicians who clearly still had that mindset, and they just threw pills at me, right? And so part of the problem that I experienced was that I had my pain treated very aggressively, which was appropriate for a limb salvage situation. But then nobody was monitoring the long-term implications of that, right? So it's just the idea that, like, yeah, your leg is dangling off, we should give you all the pain meds, right? And then I just had to deal with that for the next several months of my life. But at the same time, so the same day in the same hospital that I had, a pain specialist team just throwing pills at me, early that morning, I had a different team treat me like a drug seeker, right? They had this language of malingering and drug seeking. And they were really judgy because I was behind the pain. It was getting really uncontrolled. I was terrified because it had happened to me before. I was begging for more pain medication. And the ICU attendings team, they're coming through and saying, very suspiciously, sure, Mr. Rieder, we've heard your repeated requests for more medication. We'll discuss the appropriateness of that plan, right? So at the same time that we have this sort of like profligate attitude, we also have this still very stingy and judgy attitude. So I asked a more difficult question in a way, which was, how did we get there? How did we get to the place where we have conflicting attitudes about opioids? Because some people seem to think that they are, worth giving out like candy, and some people seem to think that they're like the devil's magic or whatever. And that story is old. That story is 200 years old plus, and it involves basically North America's attitudes just swinging back and forth from one extreme to the other. Every once in a while, we're like, oh, we really need to take pain seriously. Let's take opiates all the time. And then it predictably leads to a drug overdose crisis, an addiction crisis. And so the politicians freak out and they slam on all the brakes and they introduce new legislation. And then the country gets scared and medicine gets scared. And we talk about how terrible these drugs are. And then we withhold them for 50 years. And then everyone's like, hey, maybe we should take care of cancer patients who are dying. And we start using the drugs again and so on and so on. And so we've done that move since the 1800s, 4 different times. And right now, still sort of mid-swing. There are people on both sides. There are people who are saying opioids are still safe and effective, and we have responded too aggressively to the drug overdose crisis. And there are people saying there are still 100,000 people dying. And a lot of that still can be traced back to the fact that we were really aggressive with our prescribing in the 90s and early 2000s.
I mean, the thing that struck me about your story was that, you got handed off from doctor to doctor to doctor. And I think we see that a lot in medicine now, right? We don't have these primary care people who are shepherding you through your entire health journey. And so you kind of get passed off. And so the people who are in charge of, pain management at the time of the accident, those people had moved on, right? And it's kind of, in finance, we have this phrase called, IBG, YBG, right? You do the deal and then you move on. And then when the thing blows up, it's like somebody else's problem. I mean, is that a problem generally in medicine, where it's just about kind of getting you to the next doctor or getting you to the next phase and not worrying about the consequences? I mean, I went in for a tooth. I had a surgery back in 2019. And before I had the surgery, there was no one would give me any pain medication. After the surgery, after it was gone, it no longer hurt. I was in the hospital setting, and that's when they started trying to throw these opiates at me, right? And I was like, I don't want them. I don't need them. Like, stay away. And they're like, no, you got to take them. But it seemed weird that they didn't really care what happened outside of the hospital, as long as I got, positive ratings. And, to their credit, these nurses were fantastically kind, generous, thoughtful, warm people. But I think there was some kind of short-sightedness that they might be creating problems, after I left the hospital.
Yeah. I mean, so it's fascinating. We'll come back to your systems question. So the bigger question is like, do we have these dropped handoffs regularly? And the answer is all over the place. But, that particular story about the oral surgery, this is so common. And what's wild is that it gets things almost exactly backwards from the evidence base. So when you're in this really sort of extreme hopefully short-term acute pain due to an injury, right? I mean, even if you didn't get hit in the face or something, it's due to something wrong that can be fixed. That's actually one of the better uses of opioids. And it's not that we should throw opioids at every short-term acute pain, but facial pain can be really devastating. And as a matter of fact, if you get an infected tooth, it's one of the only times that a careful oral surgeon or a careful dentist might go back to the Vicodin that they used to give out like candy back in the heyday. And now they don't do very much, but they might go back for those really painful, inflamed abscesses and infections. So you can take a few, you can make it through until day of surgery. It's not a bad use of opioids at all if the pain warrants it. And then the surgery itself, the evidence base shows that by and large, most people can get by with ibuprofen and acetaminophen, right? We have randomized controlled trials. And that's when we tend to throw pain pills at people, because surgery is the sort of thing that makes doctors feel like opioids are warranted. Now, of course, not all of them anymore, because there's this bifurcation. So some doctors are just terrified of opioids because if you have been trained as a physician in the last 15 years, in the last 10 years, you basically were largely just told don't use opioids ever, which is not great. Not good medical education. But yeah, a lot of hospitals will still say, here, take your opioids because you had surgery, and surgery is a big deal. But that's when you could probably get by without it. So yeah, gets everything exactly backwards, and it's so common. The systems question is a good one, because it's so bad how often people get dropped off between handoffs. And that is the result of the fact that we have built up this healthcare system that really isn't designed for continuity of care at all, right? And so especially when you have trauma cases like mine, you go through ICUs. The doctor might be on a 12-hour shift or a 20-hour shift. You've got residents coming in a big teaching hospital. Like, there's barely continuity of care for the 10 days you're in the hospital, let alone whatever you do next to next, limb salvage center to get your next surgery or whatever. So I was describing this to a health policy empirical researcher as I was trying to figure out just how bad is this. And I said, our healthcare system is just Swiss cheese. It's just full of holes. He said, no, it's far worse than that. We don't have a healthcare system. Like, you use that language and it makes it sound like there is a thing, but there is no thing here. There are a million different things that are loosely affiliated with one another. And we just don't do a very good job of having those pieces talk to one another. So yeah, when it comes to pain medicine, when it comes to addiction management, when it comes to managing all sorts of difficult to manage medications, those handoffs are some of the riskiest places, because they really require care, and our system is not set up for that care to be there.
Yeah, I was astonished when you said that you reached out to your plastic surgeon, who was the most recent doctor you were dealing with. Yeah. And when you said you were having trouble, he gave you a recipe, which was probably not a very good one. And when it was very difficult, he just said, go back on them and try later, right? Maybe later you'll be more successful. I mean, this seemed like another example of just kind of kicking the can down the road, right?
Absolutely. And, so what he did is, I'd been on the opioids for 2 months. I'd been through 5 surgeries, and I'd been on the medication around the clock. And so anyone who knows any neurobiology of opioids will tell you, this is basically like the worst case scenario for relatively short-term use. I hadn't been using for 8 years or anything, but I'd been bathing my brain. I'd been bathing my central nervous system in long-acting opioids for 2 months. And because there's this property of tolerance that the longer you're on the medication, the more you need to achieve the same effect, they had to keep upping the dose in order to keep my pain manageable. And so 2 months in, I'm on about what's the equivalent of 200 milligrams of morphine. So they just translate everything into morphine to kind of make the math easier. And that's more than double the sort of ceiling limit that the CDC recommends for the vast majority of cases. They say you really try not to titrate above 90. And I'd been titrated up to over 180, up to about 200, 205. And so, yeah, I go to my plastic surgeon because he's the one who had taken over the opioid prescription, because he did the last surgery to kind of pull my foot kind of together, close the wounds and all of that. And he's a really young guy, and he didn't do a lot of trauma. All these things are things I didn't know at the time. So he did mostly sort of outpatient cosmetic plastic surgery. So he was not used to this sort of complex case with complex opioid dependence. And so he made up a taper for me, and he said, cut all of your medication by 25% a week for 4 weeks. And it's really astonishing how bad how bad that advice is, right? Because what I tell doctors, I do a lot of grand rounds and medical conference talks and stuff. And what I tell doctors to try to drive home this point is, if you want to torture your worst enemy, this is a really good plan. Get them physically dependent on opioids, make sure their central nervous system is good and bathed in the stuff, and then give them that tapering plan. And the reason it's such spectacularly bad advice is, yes, it's a huge drop. So a 25% dose reduction is really aggressive. We now have an evidence base that we didn't have back then, not super well known or published anyway, that if you have someone who's really seriously dependent on opioids, you do 5 to 10% every week to a month, depending on how sensitive they are to the withdrawal syndrome. So this was a hugely aggressive tapering schedule. 25% immediately sent me into withdrawal. But here's the other half of why it was so bad. Because suppose you go cold turkey, which is what happens to a lot of people who are using black market drugs. They run out of their drugs, they go cold turkey, they get terribly, terribly sick. Well, the thing is, when you go cold turkey, yes, you get terribly sick, but you go through the withdrawal syndrome. It takes about 7 to 10 days on the sort of standard case for opioids, all stuff I didn't know at the time. And then you start to come out of it. Your biology starts to reset. But a 25% dose reduction means you get just as sick from this really aggressive taper, and you still have to do it 3 more times. And that's what really was devastating for me, because I stuck to this tapering plan because I couldn't find any of this evidence. Much of it didn't exist back in 2015, and none of my doctors could help me. And so I just had to assume, like, I either do this tapering plan or I never get off the medication. And so I ended up being in withdrawal for 29 days. So you're trying to kick heroin on the street. You go cold turkey, you may be in withdrawal for 5 to 7 to 8 to 10 days. But I went through this process for a month, which is just spectacularly bad advice, right? So the medical education around this is so bad that a doctor could be in a position where they prescribe opioids for a living and put you in the worst possible situation to successfully get off them, which is mind-blowing.
Now, where do we stand now on pain management? I mean, right, doctors have a duty, right? They have their Hippocratic oath. I mean, their goal is to heal, but also their goal is to provide comfort, right? Mm-hmm. So, pain reduction is obviously a good goal, but health is a good goal. And when they're in alignment, then, it doesn't seem like there's really any kind of ethical dilemma. But when they're in conflict, right, the pain management and the long-term health, then it creates an ethical problem for these doctors. Where are we now? And one of the things that I identified with in your book, I mean, obviously my pain was probably nothing like yours, but when they asked me, on a scale of 1 to 10, probably, asking asking someone like you or someone like me this question is really problematic because, like me, you're probably thinking, well, I've never been, burnt at the stake. I've never been flayed alive. I've, never given birth. So, like, I don't know, how are you supposed to, I mean, what's the absolute scale, right? How do you make sense of this?
Yeah. I actually said to the guy in the ambulance, the very first time I ever got opioids was, the ambulance finally got there. They loaded me up on the bus. They've cut off all of my motorcycle gear, and I had started the pain, the adrenaline's wearing off, the pain had started to get really bad. And so I had told some of the original, EMTs packing me up, stabilizing my neck and everything. I said, do you have pain medication? And she's like, yeah, we'll get you hooked up. So as they loaded me in, she looked at the guy who's going to ride with me, and she said, hey, Mr. Rieder here would not turn down some morphine. And so they hook up the IV. I've never had it before. And he asked me, on a scale of 1 to 10, what's your pain level like? And I'm sitting there, like, in my head, this is an insane question. And I said to him, well, I've got a pretty good imagination, so I guess maybe a 7. And it's like, I had no idea what I was supposed to say, but it didn't matter, was the crazy thing. Like, he just waited for me to answer, and then he pushed the plunger. It was just a thing he had to do. But it was a wild thing to experience and to hear myself say and to watch. So your question is, where are we now? It's hard. because, I've been speaking on this for 6 or 7 years now. My TED talk on this was back in 2017. In a lot of ways, medicine has improved. So I just mentioned several ways where we have an evidence base where we used to not, right? If I get invited, one of the last really big conferences I did was I gave a named lectureship at the American College of Surgery, which is a great venue, right? A ballroom full of many hundreds of people who prescribe opioids for a living. Perfect demographic. And every time I do one of those, I'm astonished by the feedback that I get. People come up and they're very grateful and they're warm. And I never have bad experiences with these clinicians, but I am shocked when they tell me that it hasn't changed much, right? They still don't really know what they're doing. And so what has changed is they've been yelled at for 10 years, right? So every doctor, every nurse, anyone who has prescriptive authority, a PA, a nurse practitioner, they have been yelled at since about 2010, stop killing your patients with opioids. And now, after the CDC guidelines originally came out in 2016 and they've been revised and there have been all these state policies to try to restrict opioid prescribing, now pain advocates have been yelling at them, stop torturing us. And so they've been yelled at a lot for the last 10 or 15 years, but they don't know much more as a result, right? So I get a little disheartened. I'm glad the evidence base is accumulating. I'm glad that they care to invite people like me to talk. And there are folks who are generating that evidence, who are giving keynotes at all these conferences too. And so I do think that the needle is slowly being moved in the direction of more educated use and prescribing. But I feel like the biggest result of all of our hand wringing has just been like yelling at clinicians.
I mean, doctors have professional roles where ethics plays a huge role, but I mean, all of us have ethical dilemmas that we deal with every day. And in the book, Catastrophe Ethics, you talk about some of them. And certainly in where I live and probably where you live, the issue of global warming is something that's front of mind for a lot of people. And everybody's trying to figure out what they can do about it. And a lot of that has taken the form of what you call sort of, purity-like behavior, right? So, we all know people that they've got the cardboard straws and, the electric vehicles. And, it's become sort of a practice of virtue. Some would say virtue signaling, but I mean, I think people really sincerely do think that they are, doing something that's right. The question is whether or not they're doing it because they think it's going to make a difference or because they think it at least removes them from having any kind of guilt or complicity in the broader problem. And so, I mean, if you take this really seriously, then pretty much every single thing you do is wrapped up. I mean, do I buy the hardback or the paperback? Do I eat, this food or that food? And you could drive yourself absolutely nuts if you try to think seriously about the consequences of everything you do. I mean, is this a distraction? I mean, some people would say that this is a substitute for real social change. Others would say it's a complement and say, yeah, you can try to advocate for change and at the same time, try to live your life in a way that's not complicit. So is this purity-like behavior, a complement or a substitute for broader change?
That's a big part of the question that motivated me to really sit down and work through this at book length. Because I've been thinking about climate change my whole career. My very first publications were on sustainability and planetary limits. I mean, really, it was the opioid stuff that was sort of a detour because I got hit by a van, right? So it's just like I stopped to do that for a while. But the climate work has been going on in the background. And so the whole time I'm working on some climate policies and some climate ethics, but I'm continually confronted by this set of questions because ethicists, really are concerned with the question, what should I do? You know, what's my duty? What's your duty? And it does spiral out of control pretty quickly, right? So what happened in the last, I'm going to call it like 5 years, that got me even more interested in this topic is there are several really high profile folks who started asking the question that you asked. Is this just a distraction? Is it a deflection from what really matters? So that language of deflection I borrow from Michael Mann, one of the best climate scientists working today, who's worked on the IPCC reports for 20 some years now. So Michael has written a bunch of stuff, several really good books. And in his I think it's still his most recent book, he talks about the idea that we would and should solve climate change as individuals through our plastic straws and our electric vehicles and our changing our light bulbs and all of that. He calls that a deflection. And it's not a sort of accidental deflection. It's not something that we're merely doing to one another, although we clearly do. If you have any of your friends who are very virtuous, they probably let you know that they're very virtuous and that you're not as virtuous, right? But one of the things that Michael points out is it's not just coming from our peers and our colleagues and whatever. This is coming from the powerful. This is coming from BP and Shell and ExxonMobil. This is coming from governments sometimes. And so he has this really great example that I always bring up, which is that you might think that the initial carbon footprint calculator was the invention of environmentalists, right? Surely we environmentalists want to know how big of an impact we're having on the environment so that we can try to reduce it. But it was not an invention of environmentalists. It was an invention of the fossil fuel industry. And the reason they came up with a carbon footprint calculator is because they want us all looking at and talking about our own carbon footprints, not theirs, right? And that's the deflection. So Michael's been doing this in a lot of recent work. David Wallace Wells, who's one of the most influential writers on climate change of the last 10 years, he has called the sort of finger wagging we do at one another a neoliberal diversion, right? It's the classical Al Gore move. It's your job to change your light bulbs, and that's what's going to save us from climate change. Never mind the fact that the US is increasing our exports of liquid natural gas, right? Never mind the fact that we are constantly searching for new parts of the ocean, which as they're being thawed, and so they're opening up because we are melting sea ice. Now we say, oh, we can go drill for more oil there, right? No. It's your light bulbs that are doing the thing, right? Okay. So all of that is a great point. It's really elucidating. It's super important. Marianne Hegler is a fantastic climate justice writer. And in one of the pieces she wrote about this, she actually sort of gestures at the idea that when we point our fingers at one another, it's almost like victim blaming, because we as individuals, especially those of us with less power, are victims of these massive structures and these corporate players and these governmental institutions. And so when we can't choose to live better lives, when we can't choose to take public transportation, it's because of their choices. And so when we blame each other, we're actually blaming the victims of these structural and institutional choices, which I think is incredibly powerful. So yes. Policy matters, structural players matter, all of that matters. And yet, I still have to decide whether my next car should be an electric car or a gas guzzler. And it seems to me, as an ethicist, that one of those choices is better than the other. Mm-hmm. And that's why I wrote the book, because I wanted to figure out what role there is for individual ethical reasoning, even given this sort of deflection worry and the victim blaming worry.
Yeah, and I think you articulate one argument that some people make, which is no matter what you do, it's a drop in the bucket, and so why bother, right? It's not going to make a difference. I've never found that to be a particularly compelling argument. I mean, yeah, if you donate money to charity, you're not going to eliminate poverty, right? But it's not a binary, right? I mean, you're yes, of course, you're not going to eliminate poverty, but you will maybe help one person out of poverty, or help a couple people to be slightly less poor. I mean, why would that argument that your individual behavior doesn't make a difference? Why would that compel anybody to simply give up?
I think there are a few parts to it. So on the one hand, I'm with you that I don't find it overly compelling because it still feels like there's a better and a worse choice when I'm deciding which sort of car to buy, right? And my buying an electric car has no significant, meaningful causal impact on climate change, right? Just stipulate that. But I do give it credit because we have pretty strict moral rules in our sort of classical moral toolkit, right? So one of the oldies but goodies is don't harm people. So first, do no harm, Hippocratic version, non-maleficence, don't cause harm, right? The natural law theorists, the Thomists say don't do direct damage to human basic goods. Like this is a classic one. Don't hurt people, don't cause violence. Part of what I think is going on in that drop in a bucket objection is a sort of wrestling with the sense that our actions have been decoupled from the consequences that make us worry. And so climate change is bad because it harms people. And so my classic moral brain sort of says, okay, harm, that means don't do it, right? So everything that I do that contributes to climate change, I'm like, okay, I shouldn't do that because climate change harms. But the thing is, that principle was don't cause harm. And your individual action doesn't cause harm. Your individual action does this other thing, which is it infinitesimally contributes to this massive complex system that is so big and so complex, we can't really comprehend it. 1 trillion metric tons of greenhouse gases accumulating in an atmosphere and cycling through a carbon cycle that is just unimaginably complex. And so there is no hurricane that is even a little bit worse because of what I did. That's just not how any of this works, right? So my actions don't cause harm. And now my classic moral brain is a little bit messed up because I thought I shouldn't do it because it's harm is bad, but my action isn't causing harm. And then you start to think, well, I suppose this is actually a good thing because remember we went back and said, well, if climate change causes harm and so I shouldn't do things that contribute to climate change. Everything we do contributes to climate change. Right now, we're talking mediated by electronics, which are sucking up energy and causing emissions, right? And so if it were really the case that you must not contribute to climate change, we'd have to change everything about the way we live. And of course, there are some people who just sort of bite that bullet and say, yeah, like go off the grid, all renewable, all sustainable. Our world is ridiculous. We're lighting it on fire. Change everything. I'm not sure that's helpful, right? It doesn't seem like you and I having this conversation is doing the same thing as like punching someone in the nose, right? We're not causing violence.
But I mean, that's similar to other kinds of public good problems, right? So, whether you're voting, not voting, or littering, not littering, or, I mean, these, getting on the highway, right? I mean, creating congestion, right? I mean, you're just a drop in the bucket, but it is clear that if no one got on the highway, there wouldn't be any congestion, right? And if nobody littered, then the streets would be clean. I mean, is it just that when these things require? I mean, I study economics for a living, and my understanding of public goods problems and common pool problems, the more I understand them, then the more difficult it is for me to think of the action without thinking of the downstream consequences of the action. So is it just that our moral brains have a difficult time stapling together our sense of moral obligation with these more sophisticated kind of causal models?
It could be that. So that would be a sort of debunking argument, right? So it could just be that our brains are sort of malfunctioning in this situation. And so if we saw it clearly, then we would, understand our obligation clearly. So I don't think it's quite debunking. I think there is something wrong with the match between the way our brains have developed and the world we live in now. But that just means that we need a bunch of new tools, right?
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, I mean, human beings did not grow up in a population of 8 billion people instantaneously connectable through all sorts of information technology and a complex supply chain. So the world is new, and the world is weird in a lot of ways. So I think it's throwing some novel problems at us for sure. So one of the arguments I make in the book is that makes the classic sense of obligation a bad fit for this set of problems, right? So you're obligated not to punch me in the nose because you cause direct, discrete, identifiable harm, right? And now the question is, are you obligated not to take a transatlantic flight to go on vacation with your family?
Mm-hmm.
And well, when you do that, you're going to contribute a tiny bit to climate change, but it's not like punching someone in the nose, right? And so I think we need to get away from the idea that the only time something is suboptimal is when it's wrong, when you must not do it. So here are some things that we can say about your trip overseas, your hypothetical trip overseas, right? It'd be better if you didn't do it all the time, right? There are arguments in favor of doing it less rather than more. That when you do it, you're part of a problem. When you choose to do it less, you're part of a solution, right? These are all normative. Philosophers love this language of normative, right? Value, norm, moral sorts of
Mm-hmm.
identifications that fall far short of it being a duty. So it turns out I'm getting on an airplane tomorrow to travel overseas to see my family. And one of the things that I think is true is that flying comes with a genuine cost, and I should take that into account in my deliberation. But I also think it's true that seeing one's family is a deep moral good. It's not just a thing I like. It's not just hedonism. It's something that's genuinely valuable. And so I can justify it. But I also think that we have to constantly sort of be on alert that we aren't too easily justifying just all sorts of actions that are really wasteful and that are really unnecessary. And so that's the sort of move that I want to make us, push further and further into the world of nuance and not just see everything as so black and white.
Yeah, I mean, an economist would say, hey, let's just think of it as a cost, right? And it may be a cost that you're not actually paying out of pocket. Somebody else is paying out of pocket, but it's a cost. And like any cost, right? If the benefits exceed the cost, then, go for it. I mean, I can spend $500 on a meal and feel good about it because if it's a fantastic meal, and I can spend, $40 on a meal and be really upset because I could have made it at home cheaper. Right. So, we when we're paying the private cost, we get pretty good at this, right? Weighing and balancing. So why is it that we can't also kind of learn how to do this kind of trade-off when it's a social cost, right?
Yeah. I think here is where a big part of the problem is just how overwhelming the sort of current world is. And so we've been talking about a few different problems sort of as if they're discrete. So we've really been focusing on climate change because it really is this most pure classic version of this puzzle that I'm interested in, where your contribution is so tiny and we need everybody to act differently. But maybe the main contribution that I wanted my book to make was to make clear that same basic moral structure, that we are contributing in very small ways to all sorts of goods and bads, good moral projects and bad moral projects, just all the time. That basic puzzle is just everywhere. And so, you brought up and voting and congestion or whatever. But I talk a lot about economics, actually. I talk about your world. The supply chains in the modern world are such that when we think of sort of voting with our dollar, supporting companies, I think most of us do feel like there's a genuine moral sensibility of who we support with our money. Mm-hmm. And it's incredibly hard to track that now, right? And so it turns out that I think maybe the most important example to talk about is one that I learned from Siddharth Kara, the writer, that, you know, all of our phones and stuff, all the lithium ion batteries and all of our rechargeable consumer electronics, a whole bunch of them require cobalt, and the vast majority of the cobalt in the world is mined in the Democratic Republic of Congo under just devastatingly bad conditions. And so Kara argues pretty successfully, I think, that the conditions in these mines in the Congo are akin to modern day slavery, which means every time we buy a phone or an Apple Watch or a new laptop or an electric car, because we're trying to be good environmental citizens, we're participating in slavery, which is supposed to be one of those things that when you say it, you immediately feel like we shouldn't do that. We must not do that. But it turns out we do it all the time, right? These supply chains are so opaque and so complex that we find ourselves supporting just abhorrent things anywhere we look, or not anywhere we look, that's hyperbole, but so many places we look, right? So you think about this: climate change, all sorts of environmental degradation, all the stuff we support with our dollars in a global capitalist system. I talk a lot about animal agriculture system because those are sentient beings that we are systematically harming, some would say torturing, and then killing for the sake of our gustatory pleasure. Just all day, every day, we're just doing stuff that that makes us a participant either in harm and injustice or in benefit and justice. And we're having to make a million choices a day. So how is this an answer to your question? I think we're just overwhelmed, right? If you take seriously any concrete response to being a participant in the world in this way, and then just try to apply it everywhere that problem shows up, you're going to spend all of your life trying to respond to these crises.
Yeah, I mean, the cognitive load is overwhelming, right? Because you have to think through the ripple effects of everything. I mean, this is why economists are always advocating for pricing everything, right? So it mainly because it reduces cognitive load. So I don't have to think about, whether it's more efficient to use more labor or more capital in the production process associated with some product. I just buy the cheaper product, and so. What I wonder is why it is that the educated people that you and I both know who are overwhelmed with this cognitive load, why they don't demand, right, why they don't demand that our legal and political institutions kind of lighten the load, right? I mean, I know so many companies and so many individuals who are deeply concerned about climate, but in practice, they're blocking the adoption of things like carbon pricing, right? So why wouldn't you want to have that? I mean, it would deprive you of your ability to point fingers, I guess. It would deprive you of your ability to demonstrate your virtue. But you would think there'd be more demand for our public institutions to kind of solve this problem for us so we can just get on with our lives.
I think that's one of the most important responses that then we can have as individuals, right? So part of my argument is, so if you listen to, so who all did we talk about? Michael Mann and Marianne East-Hegler and David Wallace Wells, who are all saying, forget your purity. This is a policy problem. Well, but if policymakers aren't going to solve it, then it's still an individual problem.
Yeah.
We have to demand that the policymakers solve it, right? So one of the things that I want to say is what they are teaching us, what they are holding our feet to the fire about, is that there are lots of individual responses we could take in response to these just catastrophic situations all around us. And the purity response is the one that's cognitively sort of easiest, right? And it's weird to say, but if contributing to harm is wrong, then as soon as I find out that something I do makes me a participant in slavery, the purity ethic is like, well, obviously don't do that, right? Just extract your.
Yeah.
But then you show people that their cell phones and their laptops make them a participant in slavery, and we put them in a world where they basically can't do their lives and their jobs without cell phones and laptops. And now it's not a pragmatic possibility. It's not a realistic possibility to extract yourself. And so now the purity ethic option is gone. So what happens when you can't actually be pure? Well, you could throw up your hands and say, well, that sucks. I guess we're all bad people. Or you could say there are other ways. There are other ways to respond as individuals. And so those other ways are not trying to not contribute, but instead trying to be part of the solution. And so, yeah, advocating for change in all different ways. It can be voting in local and federal elections and that sort of thing, but it could also be, where do you send your charitable dollars? You brought up charity earlier. So very often with my charitable donations, I'm worried about things like who's starving in the world, but maybe I also need to think about, I need my legislators to worry more about climate change. Who can I give my money to that's really effective at getting them to listen, right? Where do I need to march? Who do I need to write to? Who do I need to call to? Who do I need to write for? So these are all different ways to individually respond. It's still an individual ethic, right? Like, should you do one of those things or another? But it's about how we engage with the structural level.
Well, I mean, I think you advocate the use of heuristics or habits, and this makes life easier. I certainly live that way. I mean, I do eat meat, but I always buy it from the butcher that I know pretty well, and I've done all my research, and then if it's not from that guy, then I'll just try to avoid the meat. But it seems like the problem there is that there are so many competing heuristics. Mm-hmm. And they're often in conflict, and it basically allows you to pick whatever heuristic makes you most comfortable. Now, there's an alternative to that, and you mentioned that you're part of a homeowners association, yeah, and that there are these dues that you pay. I mean, it's not a legal homeowners association because you're not required to pay, right, but the obligations are. It sounds like they're fairly precise, like everybody knows what they are, and then you either do them or you don't do them. And even though you're not obligated to do them, like if you don't do them, your neighbors are like, yeah, hey, what's wrong with you, right? So if is the problem maybe that we don't have enough agreement on what the norm is? I mean, like, let's suppose that there was a clearly measurable carbon offset for every flight that you took as a function of miles, and it was a standard. Everyone in the industry used it, and it was either you pay it or you don't pay it. And everyone could see like whether you paid it or you didn't pay it. Then my guess is that a fairly large chunk of people would actually, sign up for that, right?
I mean, at least people for whom that felt like an important sort of moral stand, right? As you can imagine that not everyone does. But yeah, having an established norm really matters. Because in the absence of an established norm, one, we're all just flailing. We're all just sort of guessing, am I doing enough? There's a ton of pressure with that, right? Because the people who are really morally conscientious and morally serious, they're always going to do more, and they're always going to feel worse about not doing yet even more, right?
Yeah. I mean, it seems like if it's not a binary, if it's a continuum, then it's, you either are going to try to always win, or you're going to give up and realize, you can't win, right?
Yeah. So the established norm is really important. And it's one of the things that we could definitely do. And so, that the offsetting part in particular is really hard because it turns out that the whole project of offsetting is sort of junk in a lot of ways. But suppose we could make it work, right? That sort of thing could be really helpful. Another thing that we could do is we could just think more in terms of budgets, right? how do we actually need people to live, like within what sort of means? And this is really hard because it's so dramatically low for people like us living in the United States, right? Where we actually need everyone to get is, living with an annual emissions, in our annual carbon footprint of like 1 to 2 metric tons or something, which again, we're victims of our systems and institutions. And so the way our country is set up, it's just almost impossible to get that way. But you could imagine people having a real sense to set limits on, vacation spending, that sort of thing, right? Where, yeah, you go over more than a couple of flights and people feel a little bit more entitled to judge you. So you're exactly right. In the absence of an established norm, things are very, very hard. But I do want to say, I don't think we're going to get away from the continuum, right? I think that's actually just a feature of the way the world has developed, with these problems being sort of omnipresent. And what that means is, yes, it would be great if we could have our systems, politicians, policies offload for us. So it's, I want the government to raise my taxes because I can afford it to pay for climate mitigation. And then I just don't have to worry about it, right? I do my duty. I pay my taxes. That's a way that they can offload morally for me. And it's the most efficient way. But in the near future, when our government is not going to do that, when they're not going to raise taxes on the wealthy to pay for things like climate mitigation and adaptation, we have to figure out what to do. And so it will always be the case that I could do more. And as long as I could do more, it would be better if I could do more, right? Which means we're not getting away from the continuum. It sucks. It would be great if we could, but it's part of why I want to give people some real tools to think through this, because I want them to have a sense of how you can feel justified in living one lifestyle rather than another. That's the goal.
Mm-hmm. Now, you also talk in the book about antinatalism, and this is I think a relatively recent thing that educated, prosperous people are actually talking about not having children for moral reasons, not for selfish reasons, right? But for, moral reasons. And I think one of the reasons is that they don't want to bring people into a world that they think is going to be, terrible. And I'm thinking, well, wait a second. I mean, even if the worst case scenario for global warming, which the world's still going to be better than it's been for 99% of human history. I mean, can you imagine somebody in the 12th century saying, hey, I don't want to bring my kid into a world of plague and destruction and warfare, infectious diseases and oppression and slavery. I mean, even slaves had children, right? I mean, why do people think that the world is so terrible now?
Well, I mean, one thing that's important to consider is the context of choice around having children is relatively new, right? So, you're saying for most of the history of humanity, people weren't thinking, even in this terrible context, I shouldn't have kids. But having kids was a side byproduct of having sex for almost all of human history, right? So the sort of really radical freedom to decide I don't have to be abstinent my whole life, and yet I can still choose to never have a child. That's a very new phenomenon. And so I think there are a lot of people now who, in that context of choice, which is really new, are in fact thinking the world in 2100. So if you have a child right now, you should sort of want for them to see 2100. Best case scenario, you want them to have a long, healthy life, right? And you said worst case scenario. So if we're really going worst case scenario, the year 2100 could be a just horror show, right? It's hopefully not going to be. Along a bunch of moderate scenarios, it's going to be terrible in lots of ways, but it won't be a horror show. But I mean, worst case scenario, 2100, there'll be large swaths of the planet that are genuinely uninhabitable for 4 months of the year. That's going to lead to migration crises that are completely overwhelming. It's going to lead to conflict that involves nuclear weapons. There's a version of 2100 that is an absolute horror show, right? So yeah, I think a lot of these people are like, no, I really don't want my kid to live in that world. And if I had birth control and we were living, in the context of plague or slavery, I also wouldn't want to bring a child into that world, right? So it's a weird sort of new-ish, and it's not really new. So I quote Arthur Schopenhauer, who's a pretty famous antinatalist. But this version, this sort of like new-ish version, is I think they think, no, this just actually has to do with the fact that we can, and so we should, basically. Now, I already said earlier that my daughter's downstairs at the moment, so I'm obviously not an antinatalist, but I don't think they're crazy, right? I think that's a really sensible sort of worry to have, and that we should have it. I mean, if we think that we're on the brink of nuclear war, which I hope to God we're not, but like, if we really thought that one of the conflicts going on right now was about to turn into nuclear war, I would not want to have a kid in that context, right? And that doesn't seem like a crazy antinatalist position. It just says there are versions of the world where it's just better not to create a new life to bring into it.
Well, last question. I mean, you teach bioethics. Bioethics, I mean, in some sense, it's kind of a sideshow in the world of medicine, right? In medical training, you don't get a whole lot of emphasis on bioethics. Why is that? I mean, shouldn't we? I know as a training lawyer, you do spend some time learning about legal ethics. Should ethics be a bigger part of medical training?
I mean, you're asking a bioethicist who runs a graduate program in bioethics, so obviously.
But I mean, should it be like, okay, we've got the bioethicists over here and the doctors over here, or should every doctor be also an amateur bioethicist?
Yeah, I think it would be genuinely hard to train up all clinicians or all people who work in the healthcare system as sort of, fully fledged but amateur bioethicists. But it doesn't seem unreasonable to me that, say, medical school, nursing school, pharmacy school should all have a much bigger emphasis on medical ethics or bioethics. So I get to teach medical students at Johns Hopkins every once in a while. Medical students every once in a while come find me because they're a little bit starved for this. And especially early stage medical students, so the first couple years where they haven't gone into clinical training yet, they haven't gotten very much of the sort of shadow curriculum that, I don't know, brings a bit of cynicism about medicine. But first 2 years of medical school, most medical students that I talk to are just really idealistic. They're in medicine because they want to help people. You might meet some that want to be rich. They want to be orthopedic surgeons and make, many, many hundreds of thousands of dollars a year. But they also want to help people. Like, they want to have this really novel ability to rebuild humans, to make them whole again. And so I tell them all the time, think about how intimately your field is moral, right? How intimately intertwined ethics and medicine are. So one, just what I said, the goal is health. The goal is wholeness. The goal is healing, or at least caring. Even when there's no longer a possibility of healing, the goal is something like a good death. The goal is relief. I mean, some of the deepest human goods we are asking clinicians to help us achieve. So already they have this incredible moral responsibility. And then add to it that we give them permission to do wild things to us, right? So most of the things that doctors do to us, if they did out of the context of the clinic, would be assaults, right? They touch us. They touch us in places that not many people get to. They cut into us. They burn us. They break our bones. They reposition them. They put metal in our bodies, right? Like, the intimacy of medicine is a little bit wild, and we give them permission to do that. So not only do they have this sort of, goal-oriented responsibility of health promotion, but they also have this incredible responsibility of being granted really intimate access to our bodies. It doesn't get much more deeply moral as a field than that. So yeah, I'd like them I'd like him to have a little bit more appreciation for that. Maybe if I just got him for like 30 minutes at the beginning of every year of medical school to just say that, to just say, think about what you're going to be asked to do in your career and then take that seriously.
Well, we talked about how it can lead to overload, right? If you have to think too much about it. Do you think that doctors are overloaded? I mean, they've got to worry about billing and billing codes. They spend 7 minutes on average with every patient, right? I mean, do you need to free up room in their kind of calendars to reflect on moral questions?
And this is one of the real harms that we have done to clinicians, is we have created a system in which it's really hard to be the doctor they want to be. It's really hard to be the nurse they want to be. And so, yeah, there are entire literatures about this. So it's not only clinical burnout, which everyone hears about burnout these days. Like, how many physicians did we lose during COVID? So many, right? Because we just asked them to take on the weight of the world, and then we just didn't treat them very well afterwards, right? So burnout, but also literature on like moral resilience, literature on moral injury. And a lot of this has to do with, we go back to that moral mission of medicine, and a nurse or a physician, they have this ideal of who they're going to be. They have this ideal of how they're going to practice. And it's this ideal that really doesn't exist anymore, but maybe they saw in a movie when they were a kid, the doctor who really gets to sit and hold the patient's hand and listen and spend time and form a long relationship with that patient. And if you try to do medicine like that, you'll either lose your job or be in debt for the rest of your life, right? Like, we've created a system where it's just almost impossible to practice medicine in this way and still maintain a livelihood. So yeah, we've screwed them, right? We the collective we. And it goes back to that quote earlier about we don't have a healthcare system. We just have a bunch of healthcare stuff going on. Yeah, so I really wish we asked less of them, which we're going to have to talk to the policymakers about, because, we can't do that individually one-off.
Right. Like everything else, we need to think about our individual behavior, but we also need to think about the system. You've got a nice little 3x3 framework, which can be expanded into a lot of other domains. And so I highly recommend people check that out. It's in the Catastrophe Ethics book, but also this book, In Pain, quite a moving memoir. Thanks so much, Travis.
Thanks for having me. This was a great conversation. Really appreciate it.
unSILOed podcast is produced by University FM, elevating the stories of your institution.